Hi guys, welcome to my studio. I'm Derek and I'm running a little experiment here about online lessons. And so I'm hoping you'll join me, just kind of give me some feedback as you go along and when you're finished. Um, by summer, this could be a very real thing, doing some online lessons. Now I probably need some little bit better equipment, better lighting. But for right now, this is just an experiment. I want to see how it goes. So many of you know I love Italy and I love to go there and to also go there in my paintings. So we're gonna create a painting of the view south from Villa Monastero in Varenna. That is on Lake Como in northern Italy, just near the border of Switzerland. It's one of my favorite places, and I hope you'll enjoy painting it with me. So let's get started. So here is the beautiful view we'll be painting. This is from the gardens at Villa Monastero, looking south down the lake with Bellagio over to the right there. So welcome to my first free online demonstration. I'm going to do a watercolor of this lookout view of Villa Monastero. This is in Varenna on Lake Como in Italy. And as many of you know, I love Italy very, very much. And so I try to get back there as much as I can, both in person and in my paintings. So what you're going to need for this project, 140-pound watercolor paper. This is cold press. So it's got a little texture to it. And I like to have a little sample piece handy just for testing colors out before I go into my real painting. And I'm using M-Gram watercolors, as I always do. Cobalt blue, sap green, Payne's gray, Hansa yellow, and ivory black. It's going to keep the palette quite limited. Although I do have my travel palette here, which I'll be mixing in here. And so don't be surprised if I find the painting needs a little something special from one of these colors here as well. For those of you that are just getting started in watercolor, you'll want something that has larger areas for mixing. If it just has small areas, I really don't recommend that because you really want to thin it down quite a bit with water. We'll get into that again here soon. Some of the tools I'll be using here, I've got a mechanical pencil. You can see I've already done a simple drawing, sort of a map where I want to put the paint. I've got a goat hair mop. This is a number 2 connoisseur goat hair mop. Natural hair holds a lot of water. I'll use this for larger areas like the sky and the water. This is a Rissalon oval wash by Connoisseur, 1/2 inch. This is cut to kind of a point, and it's very, very soft. And so this works very much like my mop brush, but you'll see also when I get it wet, it comes to a nice point as well. And I can do much of the painting with this. And then for my details, I have a number 6 round, Gray Matters brush by Richardson. And then I have a number 1 liner by Gray Matters, which is just gonna get me, you see, when you get this wet, this gets nice and thin for some of my details like the palm tree and stuff here. Okay, so let's get this painting started. One of the first things I like to do is do a wet into wet wash. And when I'm doing that, I take my goat hair mop and I'm going to soak an area of the paper, only an area where I want the paint to be. And then I'm going to mix up a very diluted solution of cobalt blue and then kind of drop it into there in places. And we can reference the photo back, but up in here, there's a bunch of clouds that the sun is kind of shining through. And it really is one of the things that gives the painting its nice light. So I want to make sure I leave plenty of the white paper up here. So going to start laying down some of this water. And then areas where I really want to preserve the white, I'm going to kind of leave, I don't know if you guys can see this in the reflection of the water, I'm going to leave that paper dry where I definitely want to leave some of the white. And I'm not really concerned about capturing every cloud in my reference photo. I think as a painter, or as painters, we have to kind of make this our own, you know, just allow it to change a little bit. So I'm going to get into my cobalt blue. I have a very watered down version. Maybe I'll go get a little bit more water. I'll start dropping this in. Don't want to get too dark too fast. You want to keep things fairly light. So a lot of these mountains are going to be blue too, so I'm just going to allow that to bleed down into there just a little bit. And then over on the left side, there's a little bit more, quite a bit more saturation in the blue sky. And so I'm going to get a little bit more paint in my water. There we go. So I can really get some more of that rich color. There. If you get too much paint down, you can use a paper towel to kind of blot it up in a certain area, like so. It can also help you form edges of cloud shapes if you keep it kind of random. Okay, so I'm just going to let this dry and then we'll get into the next layer. Okay, so that layer's dry, and I think now I'm going to do sort of a similar thing on the water, but of course that's going to be a little bit more of an even wash. So this is going to be quite simple here. I'm not concerned about getting up in my mountains because they're going to have a certain amount of blue too. But for starters, it's just going to get a nice sort of light wash on most of the painting, really, and the different colors that I'm using, just to kind of establish an overall feel. Don't ever want to just work on one area, finish that, and then try to complete the rest of the painting. You want to work on the whole painting at once. And let's see, this is going to have a little bit of reflections of some of the mountains. Mostly just establishing the plane of the water here. I think that's enough. Maybe get a little bit darker here in the foreground. Yeah. You know, try to do very little with it, and when you get this beautiful bleeding that's going on, don't mess with it. Don't keep going in with your brush. Just let it do its thing. This is one of the beautiful things about watercolor, is that it kind of it has its own reactions with how much water you use, the conditions you're painting in, and so on. So don't overdo it. So the next stage of the painting I'm going to work on is some of the brick and stonework here. I'm going to go into this with some ivory black, but I'm just going to do a very, very light wash. It's going to have a lot of water added to this so that I just gradually build up to that dark. Let's go ahead and take a look at our reference here for just a second. So many of these areas are quite dark in this photograph, but we're going to build up to them very slowly. So I want you to start very light, but pay attention to where the very light spots still are in this dark area. Okay, for this layer, I'm going to go to the Rissalon brush. Some people call this a cat's tongue brush, and you can see it's kind of cut to a point here. And in a smaller area, this is just gonna, that point is gonna give me a little bit more control. And I've got some ivory black that's dried on my palette here. I'm just gonna have a really watery mixture and just lay some of this in. One of the things that you guys have to be careful about as you proceed is there are some little highlights in here. And if you don't want to have to go back in with gouache, and just try to leave just a little bit of the white paper. Just kind of keep your options open. Okay. Okay. Just get right down into here too. See how that tip gives me a little bit more control? I can still get a very wide brush stroke, but I can also just get some detail work with this brush. And what I'm also going to do, since I have some paint ready, is just kind of go up into this cypress tree here. I know we'll want to see a little bit of color there, but with the light coming from behind it, it actually just reads as a little bit more of a dark. When you're in a hurry for things to dry, you can use a cheap hair dryer just to blow dry this. One of the things you want to be careful about is if this is really wet, you don't want to blow the paint around. So what I usually do is I let it set into the paper for just a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and get this dry. So one of the things that this painting has going for it, or actually the reference photo at this point, is just this sense of near and far. There's a real distance thing going on. So if you look back at your reference, these mountains way down the west end of the lake here, very, very light blue. And then as they get a little closer to us up here near Bellagio, they get a little bit darker, but in general, they're staying very, very light. So one of the secrets of working with watercolor is being able to leave the white of the paper showing through. So if you have your scrap paper handy, one of the things that you can practice is just getting a sense of, see how that's like a really super light blue? That is like 99.99% water. And then as you add more paint to that, it's going to get a little darker. And a little bit more paint still. Now, if we're really going for mostly paint with the blue, this is kind of what we get with the cobalt blue. That's too dark to even try to visually communicate that that's way off in the distance. So I'm probably going to be working mostly in this range here. Again, quite a bit of water. And in this case, sometimes it's better to be too light than too dark. You know, you can always make it darker in the next layer. But this is something that takes a little while to get used to this, I'd call it a value sensitivity with this medium. Here we are. Want to leave this guy white. A little lookout building here. just one layer over all these mountains. I'm going to come back with a second pass and make some parts a little bit darker once this is dry. And make sure you guys can see what I'm doing here. So if an area gets too wet, sometimes you can take some of the moisture out of your brush with a paper towel, and then this will kind of lift it a little bit. If you want the moisture level there to be a little bit more even. Good. Okay. My second layer over this is going to be a little bit darker. Oops, that looks a little too dark. Let's get a lot more water in there. Have paper towels handy, just so if it gets too dark, I can blot it up. I think this is going to work pretty well. Sometimes when you're working from photographs, you can even exaggerate this change in value. For instance, if it's lighter in the distance, perhaps make it even lighter in your painting. And it just helps with that illusion of distance. This is probably one of the closest parts to us here. So I'm grabbing my liner brush, or you could call it a rigger brush. It's just longer hair, but nice and small for detail. I'm going to go back into this town just south of Varenna on the east side of the lake here, and put that in. I'm going to keep that fairly light. There, I've got some bushes here and this palm tree, which is going to go over that later on in the painting. And at that point, those things will be pretty dark. But this, it's imperative that this stay nice and light. And might add a little bit more color in there. In your reference photo, you can see a little bit more green. But for right now, I'm just going to keep it along this lines with the cobalt blue. And I can use my liner brush to kind of there's some very vertical trees back there. I can get a little bit of detail worked in while I'm working off in the distance here. Okay, so we've come to a point now where I actually have to take a break, get ready for my college classes down in Tacoma on Wednesday and Thursday. I'm teaching a figure drawing class down there on Wednesdays and a mixed media class on Thursdays. So I expect to be back maybe by Friday or Saturday, continuing on this painting. So I'd encourage most of you who are following along, especially if you're new at this, just hold off and take a break along with me. Again, when I post the videos, you can do this at your own speed. But I want to point out a couple things, and before we go, we'll go back and look at the reference. There are parts where the light is hitting right around in here on top of this building, a little bit here, some sparkles off the water down here. And these areas, it's imperative that you leave the white of the paper. I'll also show you how you can go back in with gouache, but it's really kind of nice for a nice natural look if you can leave the white of the paper. So as you're painting these things, be very, very careful that you leave the white of the paper in those lightest light spots, okay? All right, so before we stop for a few days, let's go back and look at our reference. So I'd like to thank everybody for painting along with me so far. Gosh, isn't it beautiful here? Wouldn't you just like to be there right now? Me too. So anyway, I'll see you guys in the next video. Ciao.